Chapter 2, Bandido Nation. What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 3. There are only two types of people, those who are brothers and those who are not. Handout to prospective Bandidos members. The oldest member of the No Surrender crew, James Albert Ripper Rip, the old troll, Fooliger, didn't attend the meeting at Wayne Kellerstein's farm that night. He remained at home, too sick with cancer to make the 2-hour drive, oblivious to the looming betrayal of the men and principles and the veteran biker held dear. Most days, Ripper could be found inside his home in Toronto's East End with his glasses on, reading Time magazine or Reader's Digest and looking like a particularly rumpled, weather-beaten grandfather. Keeping him company in the house were his common-law wife and her ex-husband, whom he treated like a brother. His chihuahuas, Chi-Chi and Harley, the latter, shared a name with Bammer Salerno's collie and numerous sons and pets of one-percenters, and a menagerie of pet birds. For all their outwards disdain of the world around them, outlaw bikers like Ripper Fooliger are essentially conservative people. There was a Union Jack and a picture of the Queen, and sometimes also an Ulster flag in Ripper's home. And the only day when there wasn't a small Canadian flag outside the front door was on July 1st, Canada Day, when Ripper replaced it with a particularly large one. Ripper was a diehard fan of the Maple Leafs and Argonauts, while he despised American politics and the National Football League. He wouldn't consider attending a Buffalo Bills game, even if he were somehow allowed to cross the border. But Ripper was no ordinary grandfather. Other bikers loved to gather in his kitchen or backyard, sip a beer, and listen to his gruff Ripper speak, in which sleeping was horizontal Z's, and a calm man was someone with slidey fucking ways. In a world where many people nursed petty grudges, Ripper believed in speaking his mind and dealing with things out in the open. Typical Ripper advice was, say what you gotta say and be done with it. He wasn't rich, but supplemented his pension by dealing hashish out of his home and made an effort to pay his bills on time and in full. When a Toronto utilities worker suggested on the phone that Ripper was a deadbeat because he had fallen behind on a bill, Ripper called up a biker known as Big Gus, who stood about 6'6" and weighed in the neighborhood of 400 pounds. Ripper and Big Gus visited the utility worker in person at his office, and the harsh, bureaucratic tone softened dramatically. Ripper was a biker historian of sorts, although he didn't write things down for outsiders to study. It might be a stretch to call Ripper a sage in outlaw biker society, or a relic from the golden age of motorcycle clubs, but it wouldn't be an outright lie either. When he held court in his backyard by a painted wooden sign with a huge fat Mexican logo, Ripper was a living, breathing, cussing, drinking touchstone of things that seemed important and lasting in his world. Fooliger was just 6 years older in 1947, a defining year in outlaw biker history. That was the year a group of motorcycle riders who called themselves the Pissed Off Bastards of Bloomington rioted after the arrest of one of their members for disorderly conduct at a race in Hollister, California. In an attempt at public relations, the president of the American Motorcycle Association told the press that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding. The Pissed Off Bastards gleefully seized on the quote and soon began sporting diamond-shaped patches on their leather jackets and vests that read, "One Percenter." It was a proud declaration that they were among the 1% of motorcyclists who chose to live outside the law as free men, as opposed to the spunky and often annoying lawyers and students and housewives who just revved up their bikes on the weekends. They were delighted to be the kind of people other riders went out of their way to say they were not. In the end, the name Pissed Off Bastards must have seemed inadequately menacing or disgruntled. A year after the Hollister riot, they changed their name to the Hells Angels. The name had been used before, but never as successfully as a branding exercise. Fact and fiction played off each other in the movie The Wild One, which was based on the Hollister riot and came out in 1953 when Ripper was an adolescent. From their very beginnings, biker gangs have fascinated mainstream society, and director Laszlo Benedek, producer Stanley Kramer, and screenwriter John Paxton attempted to capture that early outlaw biker spirit on film. When Marlon Brando's sullen character is asked, "What are you rebelling against?" He has a petulant reply ready at hand. What have you got? But for the true outlaw biker, the real hero of the wild one isn't the Brando character, but rather Chino, played by Lee Marvin. Chino is based on the real-life figure of Willie, Wino Willie Faulkner, of the Booze Fighters Motorcycle Club, and he rides an American Harley Davidson, not a British Triumph like Brando. The Booze Fighters' rallying cry was "Jesus died so we could ride," and it wasn't meant entirely as a joke. And just to be clear, the club adopted its name because its members loved their booze too much, not too little. The motorcycle problem. The Bandidos were conceived in the summer of 1965 when former U.S. Marine Donald Eugene Mother Chambers and a group of fellow dock workers with military backgrounds began hanging around together after work on the weekends in the fishing village of San Leon in the Texas Gulf area and clattering around their bikes. The next summer, Chambers began organizing regular meetings and calling his group the Bandidos. Market and reality converged again the summer after that when Frito-Lay came up with the idea of promoting their corn chips with an animated character named Frito the Bandito, conjured up by Frederick Bean Tex Avery, the legendary creator of Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck. Avery enlisted the talents of Mel Blanc, the voice of Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Porky Pig, among others, to sing out to the tune of the traditional Mexican folk song, Cielito Lindo. Ay, yay, yay, I am the Frito Bandito. I love Frito corn chips. I love them, I do. I love Frito corn chips. I steal them from you. Why you make me sing that? Protests from Hispanic groups pushed Frito-Lay to make their Bandito character less threatening and stereotypical, and they stripped away his holstered six guns, trimmed his stubble, flattened his gut, and softened his heavy Mexican accent. Within a few years, Frito-Lay gave up altogether and bailed out on the advertising campaign. Meanwhile, Chambers and his biker buddies reveled in the very qualities that made Hispanic people cringe. Chambers appropriated the troubling little bandit and consciously made the bikers' version even more offensive, adding a scowl, an overhanging paunch, and placing a pistol in one hand and a machete in the other. They stitched his likeness onto the backs of their leather vests, lovingly calling him the Fat Mexican. There was something both menacing and childlike about the image, and the same might be said for members like Ripper Follager and Boxer Muskeldeer. Many of those early one percenters were working-class veterans of World War II who had seen the very worst of civilization's dark side while in uniform and balked at the idea of blending quietly into the sweeping conformity and consumerist ebullience that marked civilian society at war's end. The Hells Angels' red and white colors were drawn from the 3rd Pursuit Squadron of the United States Army Air Force, the Bandidos, red and gold from the Marine Corps. To them, a return to post-war life often meant being swallowed up in anonymous factory jobs, and they cringed at being nothing more than cogs in machines, unable or unwilling to reintegrate into the society they had left behind when they enlisted. They found some of the brotherhood they had known on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific in the ranks of the colorfully named motorcycle clubs that sprang up across the continent. A unifying glue to all such groups was a common quest for rebellion, adrenaline, and the company of other men who felt alienated from their own society. And of course, a shared love of Harley Davidsons. They may be loud, heavy, and cripplingly expensive. They may be uncomfortable, and they may vibrate so much that they will eventually rattle themselves apart. But if you want to give the world around you the finger, chugging around on a Harley is not a bad way to go about it. Deafening other motorists with a totally customized chopper is even better. At a time when industrialization threatened to emasculate the blue-collar worker, especially those stuck working shifts in factories, the Harley was a loud public phallic symbol, 700 pounds of highly personal raw power growling between a biker's legs. Cars were seen as confining, as one of the Bandidos' first rules was that members were not to wear colors inside a vehicle. No colors in a cage. Members of one percenter clubs are required to own a Harley Davidson, and it can be off the road for a maximum of 30 days a year, or the member has to pay the club a $500 fine. One percenter bikers who are too large to ride a Harley, like Big Paul Sinopoli or Gargantuan Paul Sasquatch Sass, Porter of the Hells Angels, Ottawa Nomads chapter, were expected to own one of the motorcycles nonetheless. Porter, whose weight was estimated to be in the range of 400 to 500 pounds, maintained a Harley. While taking to the roads on a custom wielded machine, suitably braced to hold up his bulk. As a further sign of his commitment to the club, rules call for a probationary bandito to pledge his Harley to the national office of the club for a year, to be forfeited if he grievously breaks club rules. In other words, if you don't have a Harley, you're not a real biker. And if you're not a real biker, you just lost your Harley. Honda, Suzuki, Kawasaki produced lighter, faster motorcycles, but one percenters dismissed them as rice burners and jab crap. Honda spent millions of dollars in an attempt to defuse outlaw stigma associated with riding a motorcycle by advertising, "You meet the nicest people on a Honda." One percenters countered with t-shirts with slogans like "Honda, Suzuki, Yamaha, Kawasaki," from the people who brought you Pearl Harbor, and "Fuck off, I've got enough friends." Like many original hardcore bikers, Ripper Fullager was a veteran of the Canadian military, having served as a peacekeeper in Cyprus. He became a one percenter in the 1960s during what might be considered a golden age of motorcycle clubs. Ripper could trace his personal biker ties back to 1960 when he was a teenager. He had helped design the crest of the Toronto Wild Ones, a gang with an obvious debt to Hollywood. Back then, Ripper's apartment on Sorerin Avenue in Toronto's Parkdale district doubled as the Wild Ones clubhouse. Somewhere on Ripper's body, in between his various tattoos, was a scar from a gunshot wound suffered back when he was a member of Johnny Sombrero's Black Diamond Riders. The scar was a souvenir of a nasty scuffle when the BDR tried unsuccessfully to level the clubhouse of the rival Canadian Lancers, an outlaw club with far less flair than most when it comes to choosing a name. It was also a badge of honor, not so different from the fat Mexican patch he sported on his back in his final years. Clubs were like a new home for Ripper, who grew up in a string of foster homes in the greater Toronto area, from Highland Creek to Port Credit. He was already a member of the Black Diamond Riders when he got word that his younger sister was being mistreated in a foster home. Years later, Ripper liked to tell how he arrived at the foster home with Sombrero and a collection of other BDR members. They carried furniture and liquor from the house out onto the front lawn, where some members sat on the couch and treated themselves to complimentary drinks while others roared back and forth on the lawn on their motorcycles. When the foster father finally arrived, Ripper liked to recall the young biker bloodied his nose and told him to expect far worse if he didn't start treating his little sister better. There was another story involving his family, about something that happened far later that Ripper clearly didn't enjoy telling. It was the story of how he rode his Triumph motorcycle across the continent to British Columbia in search of his father. He apparently found him somewhere on the streets of Vancouver, but the meeting didn't go well. Ripper rode back to Toronto unimpressed, and the two men never spoke to each other again. He would search out his family in other places now and find comfort in an association of brothers from different mothers. When Ripper Fullager called a fellow biker bro for brother, it was his highest term of endearment. Club membership means riding in a pack and brotherhood, and nothing is more important than brotherhood in the one percenter world. The Bandidos founder, Donald Chambers, summed up a biker's priorities unambiguously. Looking at your brother next to you and ask yourself if you would give him half of what you have in your pocket or half of what you have to eat. If a citizen hits your brother, would you be on him without asking why? Your brother isn't always right, but he is always your brother. It would be difficult to exaggerate the allure of joining a band of powerful, swaggering brothers, or the seduction of finding a new identity in the one percenter ranks. Fullager was called Ripper for the way he loved to rip about town on his Harley, though it can't have hurt that his nickname echoed the initials etched on gravestones, R.I.P. Only those who knew him particularly well were allowed to call the 5'6" biker with the bushy gray beard and ponytail the Old Troll. Such nicknames provided a symbolic break from a biker's past. Chambers became known as Mother for founding the Bandidos. His successor as Bandidos National President, or El Presidente, Ronald Jerome Ronnie Hodge, was called Stepmother. In the club list of Ripper's Toronto Bandidos from January 2005, not one member is listed by his full name, but rather by his nickname like Bammer, Rooster, Irish, Beaver, Crow, Lucky, Grumpy, Wrong Way, and Pony. The Canadian Bandidos had two choppers at one point, while the Loners in Woodbridge, north of Toronto, had both a fat Mario and an ugly Mario. Bam Bam Salerno had toyed with the nickname Babar, but it was ultimately deemed too cutesy for an outlaw biker. Identification with nicknames is so strong that many club members don't even know their brother's birth names. They aren't considered relevant, but it takes more than a truculent attitude and a Harley Davidson to be deemed fit to wear a diamond-shaped 1%er patch over your heart. Every family has its rules, especially families consisting entirely of brothers. While outlaw bikers love to portray themselves as rebels and rugged individualists, they have, ironically, developed a highly structured world with a strict, feudal chain of command. Members can vote on important issues, but their president, called Supreme Commander in some clubs, embodies the club's beliefs and has absolute veto power. So all-encompassing that they didn't just govern how club members live, but also how they die. For example, suicide is forbidden under the official Bandido bylaws. Any brother who commits suicide will not be allowed to have a Bandido funeral. Many 1%er rules are explicit and even intrusively trivial. Handouts to prospective Bandidos spell out the expectations that will be placed upon them should they be chosen to enter the 1%er life. Monogamy of a sort is promoted. Members are cautioned not to steal another member's old lady, for example, and be careful of associating with women who are too close to other clubs. A prospect Bandido was expected to adhere to a code of conduct nearly as complex as the rules governing the behavior of samurai in the feudal Japan. If two or more patch holders are having a private conversation, don't approach them within earshot, especially if they are talking with a patch holder of another club. Ask another patch holder to break in for you. Always show respect to a patch holder of another club. Even though he's with another club, he's earned his patch. You haven't. Never ask when you may be getting your patch. Never call a patch holder of another club brother. He's not your brother either. At an open function, never turn your back to a patch holder of another club. This is not so much for safety reasons, but as a show of respect. Never be quick to walk up to a patch holder of another club in a public setting, even if you know him well and the clubs are on friendly terms. If you want to greet him, walk up slowly and wait for him to indicate that he wants such a public display to take place. For men, more comfortable expressing themselves with actions rather than words. But for the true 1%er, the so-called 110% 1%er, the code of the biker brotherhood is a complete ethical norm that can be substituted for the rules mainstream society lives by. Mario the Wop, Mike Perenni, the former national president of the Canadian Outlaws Motorcycle Club, had simple, strong reasons for wanting to be in a 1%er motorcycle club when he joined the Satan's Choice at age 18. Be free, ride the bike, that's it. And being with a bunch of individuals that wanted to help each other out. For Perenni, this meant he refused to aid the police or prosecutors no matter what, preferring to settle his problems by himself, as he and his peers thought a man should. He maintained his silence with authorities, even when a mob tried to shoot him in Hamilton, Ontario, and when a prisoner in jail tried to gouge his eyes out with a sharpened toothbrush. It's my honor, Perenni said, my respect. I wouldn't be able to look in the mirror if, on my account, somebody was in jail. I wouldn't be able to look in the mirror and feel good about myself. To a true blue 1%er, the biker ethos is something rigorous, if often pretty rough-hewn. When one club member pleaded destitution and kept mooching money from fellow members, Ripper counseled another in the Bandidos fold. Maybe you can punch him in the face for the principle. It was one thing to scam or sponge off a civilian, but quite another to treat a Bandido with such disrespect. As Ripper explained, when you become a 1%er, or are trying to be, you don't do that. As for subterfuge or scheming, such things were beneath the dignity of a guy who lived by the biker code. When asked to keep a secret from someone else in his club, Ripper could be expected to snort derisively and reply, "What am I, a fucking high school girl?" Frank Cisco Lenti, perhaps the closest thing to a member of the 1% aristocracy, has ridden a Harley as a member of the Satan's Choice Rebels, Diablos, Outlaws, Loners, and a club he founded himself called the Baston, named for the suit of clubs in an Italian deck of cards, as well as the Bandidos. Asked to define what it means to be a 1%er, Lenny replied, "To me it means that you're a man. How else could you explain a 1%er? When the shit hits the fan, you don't back down. When you back down, you're a punk. You give people what you sense you'll receive from them. Treat a true 1%er with respect, and you can be assured of courtesy in response. Threaten him, and you can count on a hard fist to the face, a thumb in the eye, or worse. Being a 1%er to men like Lenty doesn't mean that you are of society's outcast. To the contrary, it means that you have gained entry into something very exclusive. Nothing represents the exclusivity of a 1%er club as boldly as the patch, the lurid symbol a biker wears on his back. Like heraldic emblems or regimental insignia, the patch stands for the brotherhood a club member is expected to live and die by. It may be no more than a few square inches of cloth, but it embodies the meaning of a 1%er's life. Each member is allowed only one smaller patch for a significant other, showing that she is his property. There are also strict rules outlining when and where that old lady can wear the patch. If she rides her own bike, it is not to be worn while riding with or around patch holders or prospects, the bylaws explain. It should not be worn in public without her old man in view. No one, not even an outlaw biker's wife, can touch his patch, and his colors, the term for his assortment of crests and patches on his jacket or vest, are not to be left unattended in public. Bernie Gwendon of Oshawa, a founding member of the Satan's Choice of Canada, and later a Hell's Angel, once flew into a rage when a fellow club member left his colors on the back of a chair at a club function, even though everyone in the hall was a Hell's Angel and the colors were only a few feet away. Wearing club colors could have the same effect as holding a cocked shotgun. It is just never a good idea to leave a loaded weapon unattended. Banished members of 1%er clubs are expected to immediately hand in their patches and all the paraphernalia bearing club crests, and to remove club tattoos from their skin, something that will be done roughly and painfully for them if they do not act quickly enough. Asked how a former member's tattoo would be forcibly removed, Hell's Angels turncoat Steve Galt of Oshawa replied, "I've heard everything from a cheese grater to burning it off to a knife." Others in the club would dismiss the comments as nothing more than the utterances of a rat, and not to be believed. A biker's status can be determined by a quick glance at his colors, just as a soldier's rank is manifested in stripes on his or her uniform. True to the club's military roots, a sergeant-at-arms is appointed to enforce the rules and sometimes to supply weapons to club members. The rigid club structure was considered essential for an individual member's survival. In similarly militaristic fashion, non-members are referred to as civilians, marking a radical distinction between 1%ers and the world around them. As a Bandidos handout for new members states, there is never any doubt which comes first. Though most things in life can let him down, he knows that his club and his brothers will always be there because he is always committed to being there himself. A patch holder has the attitude that there are only two types of people, those who are brothers and those who are not. But this relationship to the civilian world is not as simple as the club rules make it seem. Just as these groups devoted to the wildest forms of freedom contentedly submit to military-style rules of conduct, they also fret over what mainstream society thinks of them, even as they insist they don't care. The names they give themselves boldly flaunt their taste for violence and mayhem, yet they also go out of their way to claim they are simply misunderstood motorcycle enthusiasts and unfairly persecuted free spirits. One of Ripper's functions in the No Surrender crew was to coach prospective members on how to be taken seriously by mainstream society, even while disrespecting its laws. He passed out notes to prospective bandidos that explained that their displays of brotherhood should bring enhanced status from the general public, who might otherwise disdain or ignore them. Those who are less informed only see the surface. They see the vigilance of mutual support. They see the potential danger of invoking a response from a well-organized unit that travels in numbers and is always prepared for confrontation. They know that one can't provoke one club member without being answerable to the whole club, and that such an answer is a point of honor that must come to the last man. The type of respect that this generates is one born out of fear. It stands to reason that cultivating a relationship with these people is important, and to be perceived by them as biker scum would not be advantageous to the club. We, therefore, will conduct ourselves as upstanding citizens in every way, good neighbors, so to speak. The goal is to be admired by the general public rather than to be feared. Even as he advises new members to be good neighbors, he can't help celebrating the dangerous glory of a quasi-military unit that makes it a point of honor to respond to any confrontation with heedless violence. A one-percenter does not necessarily think of himself as against the law. He just wants to be outside it. He may not feel that he has to obey society rules, but he is under no obligation to break them either. In its most philosophical form, the one-percenter ethos seemed to offer a courageous man the opportunity to wrestle with the meaning of right and wrong on his own terms, without mainstream conventions muddying the waters. But not many bikers are philosophers. If there was a single day with the flirtation between liberals and outlaw bikers expired, it was December 6, 1969. That's when the Rolling Stones gave a free concert at the Altamont Speedway in Northern California. Hell's Angels were hired as security for the event, and their payment was beer. When Angels hurled full beer cans into the rowdy audience and stabbed to death a young African-American man who had been carrying a gun, many riders took it as nothing less than the symbolic death of the 1960s youth culture. As they saw things, peace and love had been clubbed senseless with pool cues. But outlaw bikers had never really been liberals or members of the youth culture. In the 1960s, as memories of World War II faded somewhat, just as popular culture began its love affair with peace, some bikers began sewing patches onto their vests and jackets with the Nazi SS symbol. Others wore FF for filthy few. The Bandidos came up with a similar patch of their own, with the words "Expect No Mercy" inside a circle. Angels would sometimes say that a Hells Angels filthy few patch wearer was the first to arrive at a party and the last to leave. A police explanation for filthy few, SS, and Expect No Mercy patches was much more sinister. They were awards for bikers who had committed murder for the club and gotten away with it. Chambers originally hoped that his Bandidos would be folded into the Hells Angels, who didn't have a chapter in the Texas Gulf area. That blending of the clubs never happened. Instead, the Bandidos expanded throughout Texas and into Alabama, New Mexico, South Dakota, and Washington State. In those early, exuberant years, members increasingly collided with the law as they became more involved in motorcycle theft, running prostitution rings, and drug dealing. Chambers himself went to prison in 1972 after he and two other Bandidos forced 3 drug dealers to dig their own graves in the desert before shooting them and shoveling the dirt back into their holes. The drug dealer's capital offense was selling the Bandidos baking soda and calling it methamphetamine. It didn't take long for people in the drug world to realize it wasn't smart to cheat a guy wearing a fat Mexican patch. It also wasn't wise to cut in on their drug dealing turf. Some bikers, like Frank Lanty, were fundamentally opposed to drugs, but others leapt into the drug trade with both boots. The brotherhood that made clubs closely knit also made them near-perfect networks for crime. As the Bandidos Nation grew, they became friendly with the Outlaws, another one-percenter gang, who laid claim to being the oldest outlaw club in the world. Founded in 1935 in the Chicago area, in a bar along the storied Route 66, as a racing, touring, and partying club, they were the strongest in the Midwest. It was common knowledge in the outlaw biker world that the Outlaws and Hells Angels didn't mix well, as was reflected by the outlaw saying of "Adios, angels die in outlaw states." Soon, there were also dangerous rifts between the Hells Angels and Bandidos. By the early 1980s, There was plenty of pressure from authorities after a federal judge was assassinated and an assistant U.S. attorney was shot and wounded by Bandidos in San Antonio, Texas. Long gone were the days when authorities considered the Bandidos nothing more than a collection of sometimes surly good old boys who guzzled beer and smoked pot down by the Texas docks. The Bandidos Nation, as they like to call themselves, changed forever in 1983 with the visit of Arthur Mark Snodgrass Spencer of Sydney, Australia's Comanchero Motorcycle Club, to Texas to pick up Harley-Davidson parts. Soon he was meeting with the Bandidos national president, or El Presidente, Ronald Jerome Hodge, and the Texas Bandidos, and the conversation included plenty of talk about international brotherhood. Spencer and Hodge shared military backgrounds and a heightened need for a sense of fraternity in the civilian world. Hodge had served in the Marines while Spencer had enlisted in the Australian Navy at age 17, the minute he could escape from an orphanage. Some Texas Bandidos saw business opportunities in a closer association with the Australians. The Texans were increasingly involved in selling amphetamines and noted that P2P, one of the main ingredients necessary for its manufacture, was legally available in Australia. The Bandidos had 28 chapters at that time, all of them based in the United States. The Australian Comancheros had just one chapter, formed in 1966, which was very much a reflection of their leader and founder, Scottish-born former serviceman William George Jock Ross. A sign inside the Comancheros clubhouse bluntly encapsulated their guiding philosophies. If it's white, sniff it. If it's a female or it moves, fuck it. If it narcs, kill it. In time, a rift grew between Ross and Spencer, as one might expect, between an overbearing parent and a naturally rebellious child. The Comancheros split into two chapters in August 1983, with one headed by Ross and the other by Spencer. But it was the new affiliation with the Bandidos that set the stage for real strife between the former friends. In November of 1983, Spencer told Ross that he and fellow members of his chapter were quitting the Comancheros to sew on the Fat Mexican. Things were ready to explode by September 2nd, 1984, Father's Day in Australia, when the new Bandidos chapter planned a motorcycle parts swap meet in the parking lot of a tavern in the Sydney suburb of Milpera. Ross and his Comancheros crashed the event, decked out in club colors and armed with guns, machetes, and metal pipes. There were some 500 people in the parking lot when the shooting started. When it was over, 3 Comancheros, 3 Bandidos, and a 14-year-old girl lay dead, and 14 ambulances were needed to haul away the wounded. What began as a quest for brotherhood ended in bloodshed and betrayal, a pattern that was painfully familiar in the 1%er world. For Spencer, the sense of loss was too much to bear, and he hanged himself in custody in April 1985. He knew that 1%ers were forbidden from taking their own lives, but he slipped the noose around his neck anyway. I want my bros not to think of me as weak, but as tired of fighting for the well-being of the club, he wrote in his suicide note. I have failed, maybe I don't know, but I do know someone will do the right thing for the club. In 1989, the Bandidos gained their first toehold in Europe when the MC club, Di Clichy, became the Marcellus Bandidos. 2 years later, the chapter's vice president was killed in a drive-by shooting, and a year after that, 8 Hells Angels were arrested for the murder. The Bandidos Nation had gone international, but the cost was steep.